Ladies and gentlemen of the Cult of Cornette, we have the honor of having on the program here this week. You know, I can name a lot of great referees: Nick Patrick, Mark Curtis, Ronnie West, Earl Hebner, all of them personal friends of mine, great referees in their own right. But the greatest referee, in my opinion, in all of the history of professional wrestling is the man we've got on the phone right now. He was there, as I said earlier, for all the great NWA World Championship matches and World Tag Team Championship matches of the 70s and 80s. And he was such a great referee. He refined the art to where nobody else that I mentioned or anybody else in the pantheon of wrestling referees could see his rear view mirror. They weren't that close. Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy Young. Tomston, how are you?
Corny, what could I possibly add to that? You've left me speechless, for God's sake. Oh.
Well, in that case, let's just close the program up and we'll end it here. No, in all seriousness.
Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much.
Well, no, at least Tommy, we're being merciful to the people that are listening.
Tommy is on the line from his home in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he still lives. Tommy, you were in the ring for the great NWA championship matches of the 70s and 80s, the senior referee for Jim Crockett Promotions. You were seen worldwide on TBS, on Mid-Atlantic television, syndicated across the country. And, also I used to literally give videotapes of you and the title matches that you refereed to guys in wrestling school and say, look at this guy, his facial expressions, his body language, the way he stayed in the match but stayed out of the way was exactly what a wrestling referee should aspire to. You didn't start out as a referee. Tell the folks how you got involved in professional wrestling in the early 70s and how you evolved into the best referee in the business.
Well, you are one of the most brilliant people in our profession. I, on the other hand, are one of the stupidest. The thing about me is that I can act. I'm good at acting, and I've got a good memory. But when it comes to learning things, I'm not very bright. I mean, look at what you did with Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I could have never done that. But I don't want to get away from your question. I broke in.
And don't people will think I paid you to say all these things, and I didn't. We're old friends, but
trust me, folks. Trust me, Corny is too chintzy to pay me. Way too chintzy. And to tell you the truth, I'm too chintzy to pay him, so we're kind of even in that respect. My apologies, Corny.
How'd you get started?
Well, I broke in Detroit. I was born in Detroit. I was raised in a suburb called Ferndale, which was right across the border. Anybody that was born in Detroit gets the hell out of there as fast as they can. Now, when I was born, which is 1947, Detroit was a completely different place. Detroit carried the country at one time during World War II and all that. Now what has happened to it is sad. But I broke in Detroit. I was a fan, just like you were, Corny. Used to watch the wrestling. We used to have it on Saturdays sometime. But the main show came on a Thursday night from Detroit I think sits right on the border of Canada. So this show came from Canada. It was called Big Time Wrestling. It was originally hosted by a guy named Sam Menaker. I think you remember that name.
Yeah.
And then later on, Lord Athol Layton. But anyway, there was a guy on there named Lou Klein who would occasionally advertise about, you want to be a wrestler? And I knew wrestling wasn't totally on the up and up. I cannot wrestle. So I never thought that you had to know how to wrestle, even though you really should. I mean, they shouldn't make it too easy to break in. And to tell you the truth, it really was too easy for me to break in, but thank God it was, because I'm such a chicken shit that if they had, worked on me the way they should have and slapped me around a little bit, I'd have run out of there with my tail between my legs. Fortunately, in my case, Lou was more interested in the money. There were two guys there that day that I went down to see him. It was February of 1973, and they both wanted to work out payment plans. The actual amount of money that he wanted was $300. This, like I said, was 1973. And they wanted to work out payment plans. I walked up and just dumped the whole 300 on the counter. He threw them out the door, but he smartened me right up, which I guess he should not have done. And he had other guys. Lou had a gym, and he actually lived in the gym. And he had little stalls in the back where professional wrestlers that are breaking in could stay there. He had a real racket going. And he never really taught me anything. All he taught me how to do was lock up. But the other guys were teaching me, and they're only a few months ahead of me. So it was kind of like a pyramid thing or a Ponzi thing, you know. The guys on top teaching what little bit they know to the guys down below. Okay, so it was a very relaxed atmosphere. I always knew that I was never going to make it in wrestling. Like I said, the hearing was a problem. I'm left-handed, although you can get around that because Harley Race is left-handed, and they don't come any greater than Harley Race. So you could get around that if you're talented enough. I could not. One night, we were in Canton, Ohio. Also in 1973, they didn't have a referee. I said, why don't you scratch my match? I think I can do it. Never had any plans of refereeing. Never paid any attention to the referee. It was just one of those things. They had to have a referee. I said, my match means nothing. Why don't you scratch it? And I think I can do that. And I did it that night, and a number of guys came up to me and said, you know, you ought to pursue this. We don't have many good referees, and you seem to have something. And that, you know, clicked with me. I thought, wow. I mean, I'm sure not going to make it as a wrestler. I knew that. They just beat me to death. I was getting slaughtered every night, and this business is a rough business, a hell of a lot rougher than people think it is. I mean, for God's sake, I was a referee, and I got my neck broke, and I was just a referee. It was a freak injury, but it did happen to me. But anyway.
Well, and you know, Lou Klein, who was famous, actually, Red Bastien, who was one of the great wrestlers of all time, was once a brother team with Lou Klein, who was a little bit older. But, you know, they had some stature in the business, and you spent some time eventually working because Lou Klein obviously worked for the Sheik in Detroit, who was the promoter and the top star. And you got a chance to work as a referee on some of those Cobo Arena shows that the Sheik promoted in the mid-'70s when Detroit was one of the wrestling capitals of the world.
You'd have thought so. But in Michigan, you had to have a license. They had a strict commission. And Eddie Farhat, the Sheik, on Saturday night, they would have the Cobo show, but they'd also have B-Team over in Akron, Ohio, in the Armory there. There was enough bird shit in that place. You'd have thought vultures were hanging out in there somewhere. The place was just awful. But, you know, I never got the Michigan license, Corny. I did
really?
Not get him. He wouldn't give it to me. Sheik did nothing for me. Not that he had to, but he didn't seem to recognize my talent the way others did. It's funny with my career. Some loved me and others hated me. How about our old buddy Ole? I mean, nothing but a big, dumb Pollock. But here's the guy. I mean, he got the position. Ole
Anderson, by the way, for those who don't recognize the name.
I'm sorry. I figured when I say Ole, everybody knows what I'm talking about because I never heard of anybody named Ole. When I first saw the name, I thought, what is that, Ole Anderson? What kind of a name is that? How did they come up with Ole? That's something.
It's actually Ole Anderson.
Yes,
who's a luchador.
yeah.
Well, I beg your pardon. That explains everything. But anyway, it was different people. Ole didn't like my repping. He would trash it all the time. Dusty Rhodes loved me. George Scott hired me over the protests of Jim Crockett, the boss. Crockett wait a
minute. Wait a minute, because in between Michigan and the Carolinas, where Jim Crockett was the boss, you actually broke into the Carolinas under the IWA, did you not, with Eddie Einhorn?
I sure did, and God, I miss those days. Back then, I got close to a legendary guy. I don't know if you ever knew him or not, Corny, but knowing you probably did. George Cannon, remember him?
George Crybaby Cannon managed the Fabulous Kangaroos and was a right-hand man in a lot of the Detroit offices.
Did you know him, Corny? Did you ever know George?
I watched him as a fan, never got a chance to meet him, but I watched him as a fan. He managed here in Tennessee, the Kangaroos and other teams. And then later on, he became a promoter, and he ran a lot of opposition offices for the folks who don't know, to some of the established promotions in Michigan, Ontario, and et cetera. And that's how you got in with the IWA.
Yeah, well, what it was, George and I got kind of close because I would do the occasional show for Klein. And back then, this was 74 now, I was starting to do a little more reffing and less wrestling. And it was getting almost all my reffing. I was doing all the Sheik's tapings, TV, or that we do it in Lima, Ohio, or whatever. But when it come to Michigan, where you could make the money, I couldn't ref. I wrestled in Michigan. I wrestled in Kalamazoo. Wrestled Abdullah the Butcher. Had to gig for him. The only time in my career I ever gigged. And I didn't do the gigging. And by gigging, I'm sorry, I mean cutting myself, you know. I got to remember there's fans listening, and I'm talking to you. Well, they probably know the language better than me.
There's young fans listening who this is all a revelation to them, and that's why we do this program, to entertain and educate.
Well, you know, I would have never done this if our business is still what it was. I wouldn't be saying these things. I
None of us would. None of us would.
Yeah, right. Well, I feel a little better about that. But yeah, I remember when the Sheik came up to me and they were pushing Abby, and didn't really know him, but I'd repped him a few times, but never wrestled him. And the Sheik said, "Have you ever gigged? Ever cut yourself?" I said, "No, I've never done that." He said, "Will you let him do it?" And I looked at Abby's forehead. And this was 74 now. This was quite a while ago. He was a crater head. I mean, it was awful. I mean, he just destroyed his head. But he
could literally stick quarters in the scars in his head, and they would stay there.
I heard Lou Albano was even worse, but I don't know. But anyway, I said, "Oh my God, talk about paying your dues. This is paying your dues." And I'd heard that he laid some kid wide open one time, and I thought, "Well, Tommy, you want to be a wrestler? What are you going to say?" "No, I'm scared. You'll be out the door so fast." I told the Sheik, "Okay, I think he'll take care of me." And I just Abby and smiled, and I was praying. And anyway, when we started to work, and cut me off if I get too long-winded, Corny. I'm good at that, as you know. But anyway, I came out in a white turtleneck, and I thought, I have a feeling, because Abby was goofy, and he might want to jump me. So I turned around and walked back to my corner and see if he wanted to do a Buddy Rogers on me, jump me from behind. And sure enough, whammo! I got one arm out of the turtleneck, and of course, when he jumped me, the ref called for the bell, beat the hell out of me, and then he leaned me over on the ropes, and I thought, here it comes. Now, mind you, I still got my turtleneck on, and he's just beating my brains in. And he leaned me back, and I thought, here it comes. And it just little short sweeps. I mean, he took such good care of me. But I didn't know that you're supposed to hold your breath to push the blood out. I mean, I didn't start bleeding until I was coming back from the ring. So he could have laid me wide open if he wanted to, but he didn't. And I will never forget that. I hated reffing Abby. I hated reffing Abdullah the Butcher, because he'd come into the ring with a gimmick the size of a telephone pole, and I got to act like I don't see it.
Yeah, don't see it. Don't see it, right? Yeah, while he's taking a double-bladed axe to his opponent.
So he took good care of me, and he dropped the big elbow on me, and then 1-2, and I think I know what he's going to do. And sure enough, 1-2 pulled me up.
Yeah.
And then laid me back down and dropped the big leg on me. And, back then he was probably about 3 1/4 and much heavier now. I never felt him. He took care of me. I have to say good things about Abby there, because while I hated him as a ref, he took good care of Tommy Young as a wrestler, and I got to give him credit for that. But anyway, like you say, back to the IWA, I got close to Cannon, doing a shot here and there, and he was close to the people that were in Cleveland. That was a man named Pedro Martinez with his son Ronnie, and they were also involved with the guy that ran that area who also wrestled, Johnny Powers, who I looked a little bit like him too. I'm sorry.
For the folks who don't know, the IWA was created by Eddie Einhorn, who was an owner of the Chicago White Sox and who had television contacts. And Johnny Powers, who was the booker for Pedro Martinez in the Cleveland territory, which was actually later sold to Antonio Inoki so that he could be a world champion in the United States. They got together and Einhorn bankrolled really, for a brief time, it was one of the great territories. They got TV in a variety of places. They paid the stars well. They were based out of Cleveland and Buffalo, but they ran in a variety of places in the country, including a big show at Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey. When they were first getting started, they had stars like Mil Mascaras and Mighty Igor and Bulldog Brower, a lot of the great names. But the IWA, with Einhorn's money behind it, one of the territories that they primarily targeted to take over was the Carolinas. So when you got involved with the IWA and you were in with Einhorn as a referee, that's the first time I would imagine that you went to the Carolinas.
Well, you've said it so well. There's not really anything I can add to that. I mean, really.
Well, there you go.
Somehow Powers, Pedro, I don't know who, but they linked up with Eddie. He was a big wrestling fan. Now, back then, he wasn't affiliated with the White Sox yet. I think that came later. But back then, he had a thing called TBS, TV Sports, and they always had all the basketball games, college games. You'd see the name on it across the what do they call it, the skirt that they put in front of the table and everything, or to cover the bottom of the table. You'd see that. And Eddie was a big fan, and Eddie wanted to use that. He wanted to get involved in it. I mean, he just loved it. He was a fan and a very nice man. And yes, he had money. But he was going. We were going all over the entire eastern third of the country. I mean, Florida, and they would go out west too, but they wouldn't take me. They didn't fly me out west or nothing. I was always in my car. Because I also took care of the books and the pictures that we sold, which Canon took care of. And I would go across the border because I lived just outside of Detroit and George lived just outside of Windsor, a town called Riverside. I'd go across the border and get the books and pictures and smuggle them back into the country. And sometimes I'd get caught, like, what's this? I got to take them back. So I just come at a later date, either take the tunnel or the bridge, whichever needed to go. But I'd always get them over here, and I was selling books and pictures at their shows mainly during the earlier part of the show, and I would close up an intermission, charge back to the dressing room, and throw my stuff on and do the main events. I was having a ball, and I worked my tail off, but I didn't even realize I was doing it. This was a new toy for me. First time I'd ever gotten into professional wrestling. Never dreamed I would be in professional wrestling. I still do not know how that happened to this day, but by the grace of God, to give me the ability that I had. I guarantee you there are great wrestlers out there that you'll never see because they didn't get the opportunity to show what they could do. I fortunately did, and I owe so much of that first to Eddie Einhorn, who gave me the TV exposure, and then later on by George Scott, who saw that exposure and snapped me right up along with several of the other IWA stars from the past.
Well, that's what I was about to say, because the IWA specifically targeted the Carolinas as a territory they wanted to run, and obviously a lot of the talent that was running opposition to Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas was blackballed in those days. They couldn't work because they'd worked opposition. But you, in that period, 74, 75, you were on the television, you were refereeing a lot of the top matches. And then when the IWA, when Einhorn got out of it and Powers tried to run opposition in the specific Carolinas area, you kind of jumped ship and went to the mainstream NWA promotion. Was that because of George Scott?
No, it had nothing to do with that. We were kind of in limbo. The last big show that we had was in New Haven, Connecticut, and we pretty much agreed that was it. See, what happened, Eddie, we got stretched a little thin and the money got tight, but Eddie was paying. The problem was that it was because it just wasn't the Carolinas. We were invading Vince, too. As you said, Roosevelt Stadium, that's Vince's backyard. And
Yeah.
the opening show was huge. I mean, we had a gigantic, I don't know how big the crowd was. It was outdoors. A whole bunch of money was stolen. I know that. But we did finish up in New Haven. Eddie had to get out because apparently Vince's lawyers went to Eddie's bosses and, convinced them that Eddie shouldn't be in sleazy wrestling. And Eddie was forced out. I believe, I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that is true.
And this was Vince
Eddie had to
Sr.
leave.
This was Vince Sr., right?
Yes. This was way back in 1975. We only went 1 year, Corny. We started at the very beginning of January. The first taping was in Savannah, Georgia. And in that taping, I was supposed to wrestle. I wasn't supposed to ref. I was driving down with two other guys. They were Jim Lancaster, who's still an old friend of mine. He lives in Ohio. And a guy named Joe Matty, who was a prelim wrestler. There was a fourth guy, and I don't even remember who it was. But anyway, it was the same thing. I went down there to wrestle, just do jobs, and that was going to be it. But I had gone a number of times to Powers' TV to do their TV in a suburb of Cleveland called Parma. That's where they did the taping. And they all, well, wait a minute. They didn't have a referee that night. Well, wait, Tommy can ref? He refs. He does it all the time. Tommy, you got a rep tonight. So no work. Ran out, got a striped shirt, started repping, and I was their head rep from then on. And like I said, they went till it was late October of that same year, 75. That was the last match. New Haven, Eddie was leaving. IWA was basically no more. It was going to be, I guess, be in limbo for a while. So a number of us were we were kind of just hanging out in the Gastonia area. Gastonia, to folks that are listening, is a suburb of Charlotte, where I live now. It's close by. And guys are just hanging out, and there was a small-time promoter named T.R. Cunningham who was doing some shows, and the wrestlers were like in between jobs, didn't really know what they were going to do. So we were doing that, and the one Mongol, his name was Guido, and I've done this in other interviews, but I'm going to do it for the sake of this too. He wanted to go see George Scott. Now, I didn't know anything about the other office. I didn't know anything. Like I said, I was as dumb as a bucket of rocks. I didn't know anything about how to push myself. I didn't know anything. I figured, well, it's over. I was getting ready to go back to Michigan and drive my truck again. I figured the party's over. Well, Guido wanted to go see George Scott, and nobody had a car but me because, I always drove. All the other guys were flying, and I would drive them around sometimes. So I'll take you over there, Guido. So I did, and I go over there. I just sat in the car. I didn't even go in. He went inside, and it took forever. So I finally go in, and George Harbin, a guy who has passed away now, was sitting right there in the front office. And I was looking for Guido Mongol. Did he come in? Yeah, he's in the back with the booker, George Scott. You want to wait for him? There's a seat right here. Thank you. Well, they come out, and Guido comes out with George, and Guido, oh, George, I'd like you to meet Tommy Young. And George says, yes, I've seen him. He's one hell of a referee. Boy, you talking about a light going off in my head or a bell ringing or whatever you want to call it. I thought, hey, he knows me. And well, anyway, I went back and talked to him, and the rest is history. What it was, his son, George Jr., was taping all the IWA shows because we were coming in, to the Carolinas a lot, but not just there. So George knew, and his own son, George Jr., said, if you don't do anything else, get that referee. That guy referees like nobody I've ever seen. And George told me that. Said he woke his boy up that night when he hired me. And I know you had a little bit of differences with George. I understand that, Corny, but I love the man. He just recently passed away, and I'm still going to stay in touch with his widow, Jeannie, and George Jr. I still stay in touch with him. I just
let's bring that up. Let's bring that up. George Scott was the architect of the ascent of Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions in the mid-'70s from a primarily small-time, I don't say small-time, they still did great business in the Carolinas, but a tag team territory that did consistent business to a territory based on big-name talent, singles matches. Johnny Valentine, Wahoo McDaniel, he's the guy who brought Ric Flair in, gave him his first shot, started Ricky Steamboat, his first push. He was the architect for Mid-Atlantic Wrestling's ascension in the 70s from just another territory to the major NWA territory in the country of the last half of the 70s and the early 80s. He was given a lot of credit for his booking then, but when he came back in 1989, when TBS bought Jim Crockett Promotions out and they hired George Scott to be the booker, it didn't work. It was a disaster. And that's where I had my first dealings with George Scott. He looked at me in the Midnight Express, Bob Eaton and Stan Lane, and our meeting and said, I just don't know what I'm going to do with you guys.
It stuns me. That absolutely stuns me.
Well, the problem was he had not watched wrestling over the previous 5 years. He had left Crockett and gone on to work for Vince McMahon and was the booker from 1982 till 1985 or so after the first WrestleMania.
Yeah, he was.
And then Vince fired him, and he'd been out of the business. And it seemed like, to me, I thought the guy had Alzheimer's because I don't know what was going on, but he had a disastrous 4 months as booker of TBS. And the final straw was when he did not promote the Clash of Champions in April 1989, the one from the Superdome where Ric Flair wrestled Ricky Steamboat for the world title in that classic match, but it was poorly attended, poorly promoted, and the TBS executives fired him. What was the difference? A lot of people have said that George Scott was a great booker in the 70s because he hired great talent, whether it be Ric Flair, Blackjack Mulligan, Ricky Steamboat, the Andersons, and let them do what they wanted to do. And in 1989, he had been away from the business for 5 years. He went into Turner Broadcasting, which was in a state of flux, and did not know how to lead and did not change with the times. And that's why it was a disaster. What do you think the difference was in the 70s George Scott and the 80s George Scott?
Well, once again, you've said it so damn well. I don't even know why I'm on this phone. I mean, you don't even.
I don't either.
Said it all. I did give George credit for the entire 70s, but that's wrong. George didn't start till 73. So he gets the credit from 73 to 80. It was 80 that he resigned. And I think you're absolutely right. George came in, and the whole emphasis, mostly during the 50s and 60s, because people would always ask me about George Becker and Sandy Scott and the Bolos and things. It was a tag team territory. And God, when you're a referee, tag teams are a dream. You guys and the Rock and Rollers, oh, what fun. But anyway, that's right. He brought in people from all over because George was down in Texas a lot. He was close to the Von Erichs, and he was close to Wahoo. And when George came in, he brought. I think he brought the Andersons in. Wahoo, Johnny Valentine, of course. They were kind of rotating everything around Johnny, and then of course the plane crash, which loused everything up. But George kind of let guys go, but he was still the booker, and I'm telling you, he ran a tight ship. I mean, when I worked for him, I had to go. You talk about an office stooge. I had to go to that office every morning about 11 o'clock and give him a report on the night before, how the matches were. I mean, the guys would tell me, you're a stooge. I said, yeah, I'm a stooge. And if I don't do it, they're just going to get rid of me and hire somebody else. You know what my job is, and if I don't do it, somebody else is going to have to do it. So there's always going to be one of me, guys. So let's try to get along. I don't want to stooge on anybody. 95% of you guys can beat me to death, so I don't want heat with anyone. But hey, you're not going to do bad things and expose our profession and get away with it, because if he finds out about it and not through me, my fanny's out the door. So, Dickie Murdoch told me one time, said, I'm here for stooge on me, I'll kill you. I said, save it, Dickie, I've heard that 100 times. So, I mean, you want to kill me? Kill me. But I'm doing my job whether you like it or not. Because like I said before, that's the way he did things, and he was very professional. And he ran
And that's the thing. George Scott ran a tight ship, and he administrated well, but he also brought in great talent. And you look at the Carolinas cards from the late 70s, and you see names like Greg Valentine and Ric Flair and Jack and Jerry Briscoe and Baron von Raschke and Paul Jones, who was another famous stooge for The Office, but he had a successful career.
Roddy, Jimmy Snuka, Paul Orndorff.
Jimmy Snuka, Orndorff, the Anderson brothers. It was literally the Cadillac of wrestling territories. And when you were hired there and immediately thrown in with the best workers, the absolute best in-ring performers in the business, it had to be a learning experience.
Well, it was heaven. I mean, one of the first matches I had was in Greenville. Remember Bill Howard? I think Bill's still around.
Yeah, he worked as Radamias in the Central States and in Tennessee.
Well, Bill said to me, first time he'd worked with me and he was leaving the ring, he says, brother, I don't know what they're paying you, but it's not enough. And everybody was coming up to me and, damn, I love what you do, man. And I mean, and it was natural to me. Nobody ever trained me. I had never had any ambitions of being a referee. I never watched the referees, but it was just something that just came naturally to me. For some reason, it was like you, Corny. You know the basic premise of this business. You know it. It's just, you know it. Nobody taught it to you. You know it. And I was the same way. Nobody taught it to me. I always felt that, it's my job to try to help the match as much as I can. Most referees were kind of just basically figureheads. They stood around, might drop down slowly to count, but they just didn't really get into it. I did. I loved it. I was involved, and I would talk to guys, and I would say, guys that didn't know me, because the first time I worked with the Baron von Raschke, one of the nicest people you're ever going to meet. Jimmy is as sweet as they come. But I remember I was, pulling on him, and he said, count, don't push. And Jimmy's, one of the nicest guys you never want to meet. So in the dressing room, I came up to him. I said, did I do anything that ticked you off? Because I remember you saying that. He said, I'm starting to understand how you work, Tommy, and I there's no problem. Don't think that I was upset by that. And but then there were times when guys would get temperamental and would get irritated. One time, Dickie Slater said, "Don't push me, man." Well, I don't want to tick off Dickie Slater. You and I both know he's a bad dude.
Yeah,
a good guy. Well, but
in his own way.
Yes. He's a tough son of a gun. Let me tell you a little story about him without making this too long. I was talking about Greenville, and this is the very same town. You loved Greenville, I'm sure, because God knows I did. Greenville was a great town to work.
And an hour and a half from Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're right down the freeway. Took you right to it. But anyway, Dickie was teaming with somebody one night, and he was working with our old buddy, the Barbarian, and somebody else. And the heat was getting heavy at the end of the match, and Barbarian, I think I'd already DQ'd him, and I'm trying to get him off the guy. He's, beating up on him. And I remember I saw Dickie coming into the ring to help his partner. About that same time, I had my face on the back of his upper arm, right where his elbow is, trying to get him off. And he just flung his arm out, and brother, he put me in orbit. I went into the air, and I remember, wham! Something hit me in the side of the head. And I went down, and I'm seeing stars, but I remember looking up, and I saw Dickie staggering around the ring holding his eye. What had happened? As I said, he was coming into the ring. Barbie threw me off that time. I went airborne, so I certainly couldn't stop myself. And the side of my head hit Dickie as he was coming up to help his partner.
Oh.
Now, I'm 180 pounds, and I hit him so hard that I couldn't even hardly see, and it didn't even knock him down. It hurt him. He was staggering around the ring, and the next day, good God, what a shiner he had. But, brother, I mean, my full weight went into Dickie Slater, and it didn't even knock him down. So that just gives you an idea of how hard his head is.
Well, and the former NFL football great John Matuzak would testify to that, who Slater beat into insensibility in a bar in Florida one night. But, Tommy, you're refereeing Um, as you said, it came naturally to you, but if you go back and look at the old tapes, a referee's job, a referee can make a good match great, or he can make a good match suck. It depends on his talent.
Exactly.
And you as a referee made good matches great and made great matches classics because you were there. You didn't get in the way. You instructed, you didn't obstruct. Your facial expressions, your body language put over the things that were happening in the ring, but you didn't try to be a hero, and you didn't try to take all the glory for yourself. You let the heels get heat. You let the baby faces shine. It was a natural talent. And to this day, I remember one of the great Ric Flair and Barry Windham matches where Windham pinned Flair to win the NWA World Championship, but right as you counted to 3, you noticed that Flair's leg was on the ropes. And I used to give this tape out in wrestling school where as soon as you counted 3, you looked up and immediately saw Flair's leg on the ropes, and the look of anguish on your face as you realized, oh, I've made a mistake. And then the indecision on your face as you, what do I do? And then finally the waving off of the bell. It was art. And it created a situation where a lot of those great world title matches were made that much better. And as the 70s wore on and you were entrusted with more and more of the main events, it got to where guys like Ric Flair, guys like Harley Race, the NWA champions, the tag team champions, the Anderson brothers, later the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express, we asked for you to be our referee because we knew that it would make, as I said, a great match a classic. And what was it like being in the ring with the cream of the top NWA talent in the late 70s and early 80s, all those championship matches? What was it like? Who were your favorite people to work with?
Everybody. but I mean, without a doubt. And, and I want you to, and I've never known that you did that, give out tapes and tell people to watch my mannerisms. I am very humbled by that, and I thank you very much. But now that I've said that, I totally forgot what I was talking about. So would you refresh my memory?
Who were the
great
best
ones,
people to work with? Who were the people you most enjoyed working with?
Without a doubt, the most fun were you guys and the Rock and Rollers in the tag matches. God almighty, was that fun! Because you and I could do things that we would come up with, and Ricky and Robbie. I mean, you know what they're going to do before they know it. Same with Champ, Rick. I always called him the Champ. I'm not close to him anymore, but as far as like professionally, my God, I could talk about Ric Flair for a solid week and I'd still have stuff to say. He was the king. And he's overstayed his welcome a little bit maybe, but that's a maybe. I don't know that. I mean, he's still over like crazy. I don't think anybody in the Carolinas doesn't know the name Ric Flair. He might be the most well-known person in the entire Carolinas. And he was great. Steamboat, you guys, and of course managers were so much fun because that's more distraction for me so that there's more heat behind me. Because as you know, the main difference between wrestling now and wrestling back then, Corny, is one word: heat. There's no heat anymore. They do stuff in the WWE. Once in a while, I'll turn it on out of curiosity, but I don't watch it on a regular basis. But no matter what they do, the fans do not seem to get angry. They can be brawling in the audience, and I've seen guys all standing around with beers, slapping them on the back and laughing while the guys are brawling. If you and I went in the audience, Corny, we would have been assaulted, attacked, possibly slashed, knifed, and people might say, "You want that?" I said, "Yes," because the people were in it. They believed it. They don't believe it now. Now it is entertainment. I'm not taking away from the boys. The boys work as hard as they ever did, although God knows they've got soft rings in the WWE. They don't have the rings that I worked in. I mean, I remember when you set up that thing for me in '98, with the answer to the NWO, and that was the first time I'd ever worked for Vince. I owe that to Corny. You are the one that got me those bookings. And I remember when I got in that ring, and I thought, my God, it's like a trampoline. I can't believe it really. And the ropes were so loose, and I thought, And our rings weren't bad, Corny. You know, we had great rings. But they weren't like that. I mean, you didn't bounce up. There was a ring in Augusta that was like that a little bit, and it was difficult to deal with, Augusta, Georgia. But the difference was monumental. I mean, their rings were they're just so much softer than the ones that I know now. But there's no heat anymore, Corny. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, there were times when, boy, you had to fight your way out. And a lot of times I'd be trying to drag you out like I'm getting mad at you, but all I'm trying to do is get you out of the way of the people. And
you were trying to protect me, and that's the old thing that the guys used to do was when the heels had so much heat that the audience was ready to attack them, the baby faces or the referee would jump in and be beating the heels up in a working way so that the fans would not beat them up or knife them or cut them in a shooting way. And you know,
go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just were you there the night in Greenville that Ole Anderson was cut by the old man?
No, and that was really stupid on his part because you don't go into the audience. And the guy that he went after wasn't even the guy that slashed him. It was some old man who was standing nearby that I guess Ole wasn't expecting. And because of that, he was able to get him so good, just slashed him. He didn't stab him, but he slashed him from top to bottom. Ole was laid open pretty wide. And you know, that is so dangerous. You know, one time we were in Atlanta in the Omni, and it was a cage match. And Barry Darsow, back then, you know Barry, he was calling himself Crusher Khrushchev. That's who he was back then. Well, Nikita and Ivan, I think, were in the cage. I'm not exactly sure, but Barry was in the outside, and this was after the match was over, and the fans were really up close, and they were hitting at Barry, at Barry, and I got myself in a position where I'm yanking on Barry. You get off that door, but I'm in between him and the fans, so the fans can't get at him. And they think I'm on their side, but I'm trying to protect him from them. And he was nice enough to come up to me and said, "Thanks, I saw what you did there. I really appreciate that." I said, "We should always do that. I mean, try to make it look like we're trying to, you know, like
how many riots or fan incidents or guys jumping in the ring to go after the heels with knives or their bare fists? How many of those did you see over your years in refereeing?
To tell you the truth, not many. That rarely happened. I never saw anybody come into the ring with a weapon. There were a few times that fans came into the ring and then, well, now that I'm in here, what the hell am I going to do? and we had one thing on tape where this fan came into the ring. We were taping in Columbia. You remember Columbia, South Carolina, at the county hall there. And Nikita had a lot of heat. And this fan hit the ring, got by Doug Dellinger and the security, and all he did was he just tackled Nick and pushed Nick into the ropes, and Nick's like, "Well, what's this?" Well, I told the guy, you know, because the cops are coming in, and I pulled the guy away, and I said, "Get out of here before you get killed." And he was they got him and threw him out and all that, but Nikita didn't even have the heart to beat him up. But some guys, you get on the ring and you're fair game. Other guys figure, well, they just got too carried away, and as long as they didn't hurt anybody, it all boils down to what it means to you. I mean, I remember Paul Jones. If a fan touched him, if a fan even touched Paul Jones, he had to get that fan back. That's how lack of professional he was. Whereas a guy like Terry Funk, he'd go into the audience. You know Terry, Corny. He'd go into the audience, and he'd let the audience beat his brains out, and he didn't even fight back. Terry he figured, well, I'm in the audience, let them have their cookies. Terry was a pro, and I still stay in touch with Terry. I don't like to call him too much, but God, he's one of my heroes, and I know he's one of your heroes too, Corny. He's just so great. I love Terry Funk.
You know, that's the thing, Tommy, is Terry Funk is a legend and was so good at rousing the crowd and getting a match over. Were you the referee in Nashville when Terry came out of retirement at the final Flair and Steamboat match of the '89 trilogy? I think you almost had to have been when Terry came from ringside where he was one of the judges and gave Flair the pile driver and started that program.
Well, bite your tongue. Of course I was there. You were there too.
No, I wasn't. Remember,
you were not there. Oh,
That's
okay.
when we had given our notice because
That's
Scott
right.
didn't want to use
Yeah.
us, and
Yeah.
we actually worked out our notice, but George Scott got fired beforehand, and we took 2 months off and came back in June. So I was sitting at home. That's the only
I'll be
WCW
damned.
pay-per-view that I actually watched at home as a fan, and was surprised and saw not only that great match between Flair and Steamboat, but also the angle with Terry, who was one of my childhood heroes, and that launched the Funk and Flair program that took up much of the next year. But you were the referee. You were the referee on so many Flair Steamboat matches, and they were the gold standard, the state of the art of in-ring performance in the 70s and in the 80s. How did their late 80s matches differ from the matches that just a regional audience saw in the late 70s when they were really younger and actually more athletic, maybe not quite as smart? But how did those matches differ?
Well, first of all, let me finish that other question, which is about Terry. Yeah, I was there that night, and he was a judge. And Flair, as I recall, went over Steamboat. And then Terry beat the living hell out of Rick. And as I recall, I think he pile drove Rick on the table.
Yep.
And then Rick went around with the neck collar on. And then, of course, Rick went around and was beating the hell out of Terry. And that was right when I think he had just made Roadhouse, I think. And Terry was kind of banged up. And I mean, that's what I mean about him. Flair just beat him to death every night. And I remember one time me, Dickie, and Terry were hanging out, and Terry had to go to the doctor, and the doctor was telling him, quit what you're doing. I thought, Terry, why are you going to the doctor? You know you're not going to listen to him. But I mean, he was all banged up, and that was
actually that was the time period where Terry had actually broken his tailbone, and when he flew to the matches, he couldn't sit in the airplane seat. He had to kneel in the seat and hug the back of the seat because he couldn't sit on his broken tailbone, but he was still fulfilling all his commitments.
It was like that in the car too. He couldn't even hardly sit in the car. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, I love this man. I would do anything for him at any time. And Dory's a great guy too, but God, I love Terry. And now the answer to your question, Steamboat, of course, came along, and he came over from Atlanta. There's another thing. Ole wasn't doing anything with him. Ole sent him to George, and he came in. And I want to tell you, the first time I worked with him, Corny, we were in a town, you might remember, it's called Colonial Heights, Virginia.
Yes.
It's a suburb of Richmond. And he was working with another old friend of ours who lives in Charlotte here, Sergeant Jacques Goulet. You remember Jacques?
Rene Goulet, who later became
Goulet,
an agent for the WWF.
Yeah, his real name is Robert Bedard. But anyway, anyhow.
Well, thank you for outing him to the government and everybody under his real name, but go ahead.
I didn't spell it and a lot of things, okay? I don't think it's quite that simple. But anyhow, I was, George was the booker, and it was a spot show, so I was doing the whole show. And I drove up there, whoever I was with, I don't know, but he wrestled Goulet that night. Prelim match, I think it was second, maybe even third. Corny, they went Broadway. Now, folks, Broadway is a draw. The match just went through. Nobody won. It's a draw. That audience just went out of their minds. And like I told you earlier, I had to report to George. And I remember I couldn't wait to hit the office that morning. George, I don't know what your plans are, but for God's sake, take a look at this guy big time. He just worked a Broadway last night. Nobody knew who he was, but he's such a handsome guy, and he's got such a hell of a build, and he's got that $1 million smile, and he can sell like nobody's business, and the audience just, they loved him. They were living and dying with him, and he was selling, and this was just a Broadway, and the next match could hardly even follow it. I said, God, take a look at him. And about that same time, I think, Flair told George, because George said to Flair, what do you want to do? George kind of let the guys do it. And George says, let me do something. Or rather, Flair said, let me do something with Steamboat. And then they did that thing. As I recall, Steamboat came out. Oh, I think he rubbed
He
Sting's
scraped his
on the
face. He
floor.
scraped his face
Oh,
on the floor, right?
hard weighed him. Oh, it was scary looking. Rubbed his whole face off. I mean, it was raw. Oh, that had to hurt. And I mean, it was the real thing. He was dragging his face across that floor, paying your dues, Corny. And that got over so well, got him the sympathy. And then I think it was a week or two later, Flair comes waltzing out with a couple of gals on his arm, and Steamboat come out, threw him into the ring, beat the hell out of him, and stripped him down to his small little briefs, little skivvies. And Flair's standing there with nothing on but his shoes, socks, and his briefs. But man, money.
And that was
Go
was
ahead.
the original angle between Flair and Steamboat, and they redid that on one of the 1989 Clash of Champions with a much bigger budget. With Flair came out with the models, and then Steamboat came out and confronted him and beat him up and stripped him down to his underwear. But in the first angle, a lot of people don't know this, in the first angle, one of the models was later to become Mrs. Flair. It was Beth, who was one of the models that was hired to do that original angle, and she later married Rick and was with him for a great many years, probably more than all the rest of the Mrs. Flairs put together. She was Cleopatra.
I mean, yeah. He called her Cleo.
Yeah.
And she's still a friend. She's still here in town. Very tragic when Reed died last year, and that was gut wrenching. There weren't that many people that were there. Jerry Briscoe flew in. Jerry was there. Good to see Jerry, and my old buddy Charles Robinson. He was there. He came down because Charles Robinson also became a family friend of the Flairs, like I did.
Little Nate.
Little Nate, yeah, because he got the push and got to be the Little Nature Boy for a while, and he's still doing well in WWE. So bless his heart. But that's basically all that was there. And I guess Rick was hanging in there, but Beth was devastated. So that was just so sad. I mean, I don't know how Reed would have done in the business. I wasn't real wild about his attitude, but he always seemed to listen to me if I said something. Had a bad situation with Manny Fernandez, but you know how Manny is.
Who hasn't?
Manny's really a good guy. You have to understand Manny. I mean, you really do. Just like Tully. You've got to understand Tully. You know how Tully, remember that time when he came into Hampton and just started messing with you?
Yeah.
He took a swing at you.
As a matter of fact, he did. Because he was mad because I had not made Huntington, West Virginia the night before when we had been in Charleston, South Carolina the night before that, and I was sick, and it was 450 or 500. No, I'm sorry, 500 miles in between, and I had not made the show until he got hot at me and that's what happened back in those days, and I learned a lesson from it. Sure, it was 500 miles in between towns, but whether you were sick or you had the shits or whatever, you made the town.
He still should not have done what he did, though. That was out of line. I mean, it didn't amount to anything, and you didn't make a big deal out of it, and that was pretty much the end of it. But one time we were
you know what, Tully, Arn Anderson called him the Wombat or Eddie Munster, but Tully, if it hadn't been for Flair loving him as a person, Tully wouldn't have reached the heights that he reached in Crockett Promotions, but Flair saw the personality, the performer behind the prick, and that was part of what made Tully was that everybody disliked him. People who knew him and the fans as well at that point in time in his career. But Flair was behind him and made him one of the horsemen because of the fact that he could get heat with anybody.
Well, he had demons, Corny. You know that. I mean, it was a lot of Tully was having a lot of problems with his personal life, and he couldn't separate the two. And he'd come in being in such a miserable mood. And we talked about the one in Hampton. I don't know if you remember this one or not. I don't know if you were there, but you probably were. But maybe this is when you were gone. But we had a show in the Met Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it was one of those bunkhouse stampede things that Dusty did, and Tully. And it was a thing where Tully was supposed to come back later and wrestle Dusty. They were supposed to be the last two guys left. I don't know why this happened, but, you know, I love Battle Royals because all I get to do is walk around the floor and tell the ring announcer, that man eliminated, you know. I didn't have to do anything. Well, I was walking around the floor, and Tully went over the top rope, and he landed on the apron, but he didn't hit the floor. I wasn't looking, and I bumped into him. Not real hard, but he falls off the apron onto the floor. I immediately said to the timekeeper, Tully Blanchard can go back into the ring. I caused him to fall off the ring. Tully was starting to walk back to the dressing room. And when the announcer said that, he had to turn around and come back. And he was glaring at me and cussing, and I thought, well, what did he think I was going to do? I mean, if he leaves, what are we going to do about the finish? He ain't going to be out here. What's going on here? Well, anyway, he did it and all that in the dressing room. He come up. He called me everything but a human being, got right in my face and everything. And I'm clenching my fists. I thought, if this keeps up, I'm afraid I'm just going to swing. And either he's going to whip my ass or I'm going to whip him, because there's, you know, you take so much and then you're ready to fight Godzilla after a while, you know. And nobody would say a word. Nobody would say, come on, Tully. Flair was sitting there. Nobody spoke up on my behalf. And I took it all, and I didn't confront him. He called me everything he wanted to, and then I think a day or two later he may have apologized. But, I mean, he blamed me for something that if I had let it go, it would have screwed up everything. So I didn't understand what that was about. But I really do like Tully. He's got some emotional, you know, difficulty, like we all do. And I really think he straightened himself out good. He's been doing the motivational speaking. I talk to him every once in a while, not very often. I've got his number, and I got respect for him because even though Flair liked him, let's face it, he was not very big, Corny, and it was hard for him to, you know, really, I mean, wrestling Dusty, I mean, it's such a big difference in the size there. I guess I should say weight more than size, but you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you mean.
But I really like Tully. I think he was a good guy, and I thought he drew a lot of money. He was a good horseman. I really feel that he was, and I thought he did that job real well.
Hey, you know, I tell you what, we are way over time, and I could do this all day because I got to tell you, folks, while we're still on the air, Tommy Young is one of my favorite people. At one point, he was the fourth member of the Midnight Express. Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, and I, later Bobby Stan Lane and I, didn't travel with a lot of people. We always traveled with ourselves, but Tommy was always, more often than not, in the car. He was the fourth Midnight Express member because we loved him to death. We loved him as a referee. You and I, Tommy, had our squabbles because
we had a few. We did.
We were both
airport. Oh God, we almost had a fight there.
We were both persnickety in our own way, but I wouldn't have traded our time together for anything. You made so many of our great matches classics. You made so much of our road time entertaining, and you still remain to me the gold standard of what a professional wrestling referee should be. You were the greatest in your genre of all time, and I salute you for that. And the only thing that makes me want to sign off right now is the fact that you're going to be there in Charlotte at the NWA Legends Fan Fest, July 31st through August 3rd. I'll say it in a minute. I'm so verklempt. And you're going to be a part of our podcast, Jim Cornette and Friends, that we tape live on the night of Thursday the 31st. And I appreciate you being a guest here on the program. We could tell stories until the cows come home, and we probably will.
I hate to sign off now, but I guess we got to do it, huh?
We got to do it, but that's only so I can bring you back. And if we don't get everything done in Charlotte, we're going to do it again here on this podcast. But ladies and gentlemen, I promise you never talk to a not only a better pro wrestling referee, but a more entertaining human being than Tommy Young. And I appreciate you being on the program, and everything you say tickles me because we've had such a great relationship for 30 years now that you can read the phone book or the ingredients of a cereal box and it will still make me laugh because I know the person behind it. Tommy Young, I thank you for being on the program. You had a great career. We'll talk maybe in Charlotte, maybe later here on the program about the reasons and the incident behind your retiring from pro wrestling, but the business has been worse for your loss and for the fact that you are not in it. And also, you worked for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling as a road agent, and you were instrumental in training Mark Curtis, my friend Brian Hildebrand, who became one of the great referees in the business in the 90s because of his time with you and his dedication to the business. And I thank you for that. But Tommy, we're out of time. We're over time.